Alright, well, this video is entitled Sigma, the death knell of the Voxian sociosexual hierarchy. Why do I call it that? Well, because Vox came up with this sociosexual hierarchy, which is quite useful, although at first, when I first glanced through it, I just thought, oh, it's some pickup artist type nonsense. But then over time, I understood he meant it well beyond that, as his recent series on the alpha and the gamma and so on. However, I suspect that Vox is going to take a while before he does the Sigma segment on the sociosexual hierarchy, mostly because when it first came out, it became a standing joke, and recently on one of his streams, I mentioned it. Once the Sigma classification came out, everybody wanted to be a Sigma. Everybody was suddenly a Sigma, and it got to the point where it became a joke. It's like, well, unless you're dual wielding 45 Colts while hanging upside down from a helicopter, you're not a Sigma, and that's what he came up with in one of his last streams, to which he quite correctly laughed at. Now, the thing is, as Vox pointed out, the sociosexual hierarchy is a pattern of how you are seen by others. Very much like the Red Indian thing of being given a name by the tribe. I didn't pick the name the Kurgan, it was given to me by the tribe, the Red Ilk. And that's pretty much, I guess over time I've come to appreciate that, probably it sort of fits. I mean, I did one of those silly, like, which science fiction character are you type quizzes, and it was quite a long one. I was surprised. I thought it would be like 3 or 4 questions. Anyway, I came out as Darth Vader, which like almost no one gets. I was like, what the hell, and it's like, you're the most evil bastard in the galaxy, but you will do what you want, It was sort of like, I'm not evil, But now the thing about Sigmas is they are necessarily a small percentage of the population. There was an interesting comment I read somewhere, I can't remember on whose stream or whatever, where one guy said something like, oh, do INTJs also, is there a correlation between INTJs and Sigmas? Now, INTJ is one of the classifications of the, I forget the name now, but it's one of the, whether you're introvert, extrovert, judgmental, or, flexible, not flexible, that sort of thing. It's one of the personality scales that has been used quite extensively. And when I read that, I thought, there might be something to that the INTJ and Sigma classifications maybe go together more than any other classifications for Sigmas. But we also, amongst the Dread Ilk, have discussed this quite to death, and on all the various bits. And, like Vox says, it's fractal. There's people that can be situational alphas, and there'll be betas in some other things, bravos or whatever. Now, the thing about Sigmas is I think there are actually 2 types of Sigmas, which is sort of an important distinction. I think that the way that Vox explained it is that a Sigma is a late developing omega. And as he has himself said, being a Sigma is the a result of damage at a relatively young age. And I think there's definitely something to that. But I think there are essentially 2 types of Sigmas. One is the one that I think Vox is, which is, Vox is perfectly happy being quite far removed from the rest of humanity, and he's obviously very comfortable in his own company, and those are traits we have in common, in that I'm very comfortable in my own company and so on. However, I don't necessarily shun human contact as much. I kind of do to a certain extent, because most people are idiots and they are tiring, but I think the main difference is that I think I'm a genetic Sigma, in that my family, if I look at the history of my great-grandfathers from both sides, from my grandmother's, both paternal, these are paternal lines. From my paternal grandmother's side, her father was definitely a Sigma. He is a guy that left home at 13 because he ran away from home several times. And eventually his father said, well, why are you running away from home? What do you want to do? And his son told him, I want to be a deckhand on a ship. So his father took him to the port and put him on a ship. That guy went on to become a general. He spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese. He was in the Boxer War, as a mercenary, I think. He definitely did all sorts of weird things. His wife thought that he had died. And then back in those days, there was no way to really know. And 10 years later, he turned up at home. And she, by then thought of herself as a widow for over a decade. And she basically went nuts. I actually met my great-grandmother. She was in a mental institution, and I remember seeing her. I was about maybe 2 years old at the time. I only saw her one time, and I went there with my grandmother, who never really spoke about her. My grandmother was raised in an orphanage by nuns, which, despite the fact that she really didn't like them, for very good reasons, she was a Catholic that went to church all the way throughout her life. Now, my paternal grandfather's side, his dad passed away when he was relatively young, about 19 or so. But his dad was also an explorer, kind of a hunter. And there used to be, until quite a few years ago, a plaque in the village where he was living in the Veneto region, because he had found a little brook which he had channeled into the village so that there would be fresh water in the village, and that made a plaque to him. I tried to go and find the plaque in the, I think it was in the early 2000s, or 2006, something like that, but they had recently redone the piazza and they'd removed the plaque. So, from both sides, you've got guys who are definite explorers, willing to delve deeply into the unknown. And again, even my grandfather, who was a very logical man, he left home when he was 19. He went to a different city across the country from where he was born. So he went from Veneto to the Piedmont region, which back in those days might as well be like going to Africa. My own father, left Italy to go and start a business not in South Africa, in Nigeria originally, working for some guy, and then he started his own business later. And he's definitely another Sigma guy. My father really, I don't know if he even has a concept of of the social hierarchies. He's so far removed from it that it's quite funny. And I'm somewhat the same. I'm very curious and I like exploring things, very often to my own detriment, similarly with my own father and so on. So, and we have a generations of this, because we originally come from, the legend goes, the survivors of Troy, who then came over to Italy, who then came further north and went to Venice, and the Venetians are known to be the survivors of the Battle of Troy. That's the legend. But the thing is that my family's history follows that trail, documented for at least 800 years, and quite a bit more than that, probably about 1,200 years that we have some evidence of. So I think that I'm genetically sort of a Sigma, and I came up with this classification as Scout myself long ago, long before I met Vox or knew anything about Vox. I'd come to the conclusion that you've got alphas, betas, and scouts. A scout has to exist because in primitive days, if a primitive people found a member of another tribe somewhere near their area, they would kill him. I mean, this still happens in places like Papua New Guinea, the Amazon jungles. When a member of a tribe that is not yours is found in your territory, it is very common that they would kill him because he's just a threat. There's no benefit that could possibly come from, taking him in and so on. Nevertheless, some people must have had the ability to do this, to infiltrate other tribes and survive, which means breeding with the females of this other tribe and not being killed for it. that is quite an achievement. And especially, the further back in history you go, the less likely it is that you can survive doing that sort of thing. Nevertheless, some people must have been genetically predisposed for doing this. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the expansion of the human race the way we had it, the intermixing of various, tribes, aside from, the genocidal sort of taking over of nations, which is the most common way in which it happens. And I think I'm pretty much one of those guys, which, and I came up with this theory many years ago, which I thought, well, if I'm right about that, then the likelihood is that such people will probably almost invariably have children with different women, possibly also from different tribes, different nations, different structures, different ethnic backgrounds, and so on. And so far that's sort of proven a little bit to be the case. Also, we're spread out as a family. I mean, my father, my brother, and myself all live in different countries, separated by thousands of kilometers, if not hundreds. Hundreds and thousands of kilometers. And we've all had children with various different types of women. So although my brother has only had the one child, but we are able to infiltrate other nations and obviously breed successfully with them. So that type of sigma, I think, is a different type of sigma to the late developing omega that Vox was talking about. There are elements of it that are similar. There are elements of the sort of, outcast from the beginning. So you take that on at a pretty early age. But in my case, it was probably due to the fact that I was different. I was, yes, smarter, but I also grew up in different countries. I, left Italy when I was relatively young, although I did go back there now and then. But, I studied there a little bit when I was younger. But the fact is, I grew up as an outsider in various different nationalities, surrounded by people that were sort of pretty different from me, culturally at least, and many times also, at a pretty obvious physical level. So I think those are two different types of sigma mentalities, which, and I've given this some thought. Why, how would that affect you? And I think possibly the environment is the difference between Vox and myself that has made it so that Vox is a lot more strategic, while I'm a lot more tactical. But sigmas are interesting characters because they can sort of change the course of history, or at least have quite a large impact on society, despite the fact that they are outcasts, outsiders. The typical sigma in film would be the James Bond guy, which is why I've got the cover picture that I do, the thumbnail. James Bond is clearly a sigma. So was, the man with no names in the Sergio Leone films that was usually played by Clint Eastwood. Some nameless guy who just comes into town and kicks ass and does his own thing. Similarly, in the Japanese classic by Akira Kurosawa, Yojimbo. Yojimbo was clearly a sigma, playing both sides, doing his own thing. And that is, as Vox puts it, sigmas are a pain in the ass because they do their own thing. They ignore sort of social norms. Sometimes they ignore outright rules of the company or institution or country or laws or whatever. They tend to trust their own compass needle more than anything else, which, frankly, to me, that's like breathing. It's just normal that you would do that, but it's not common by anybody else's standards, including alphas. One other aspect that I thought was interesting that I came up with scouts is that the sigmas definitely have the ability to be quite chameleontic in that they can play to a beta role when needed. They can play to a bravo role. They can be a guy who's just making shoes in his little corner of the cave, or they can be the lieutenant to the alpha, or they can, they can blend in. They're pretty flexible. They can do a lot of stuff. They can be the guy that goes hunting for the tribe, so he's doing his own thing, but he still contributes. At the same time, the most dangerous creature on Earth for an alpha is probably without a doubt a sigma. Because a sigma is not interested in, taking over the role of an alpha at all. But if the alpha makes the mistake of thinking that he can he can treat the sigma as some kind of, underling, or run roughshod over his things that matter to the sigma and so on, sigmas can become hyper alpha to the point where they will take an alpha out. And they can do that quite effectively. The last thing you want to do is piss off a sigma when you're an alpha that thinks he's safe from the sigma. You're not. If that sigma gets it into his head that you've done him wrong, he will take you down, whether it's socially, economically, politically, physically, whichever way. And sigmas are extremely resourceful because they're used to being the outcast. They're used to being in difficulty when compared to the rest of society. They don't necessarily play well with others because it's kind of like, fuck you, I do what I want pretty much all the time. So they are difficult to slot into a social hierarchy. And when and if they become warlords, they're invariably, almost invariably, reluctant warlords. But they can be extremely effective ones. So again, generally, when it comes to sigma, the general idea is, if in an organization, is give him a task that he can do on his own, in his own way, and let him get on with it. Just give him an objective and say, look, that's what we need. Does that suit you? Are you okay to do that job? Get on with it. And then just let him do it. Because he will do it. And they are self-motivated people. Of course, like everybody, they respond to praise too and whatever. But often you don't have to, it's often better to motivate a sigma with praise rather than with a stick. They respond much better to carrot than the stick, which is also unusual, because most human beings will tell you that they respond better to carrot than stick, but in reality, very often they respond much better to stick than carrot. Sigmas, that's a cardinal mistake. You try and use a stick on a sigma, he's gonna eat you alive. Mostly because sigmas use the stick on themselves. That is how they motivate themselves more than anybody else. Sigmas are often abrupt with people, considered socially, monstrous, unforgiving, harsh, ruthless, blah, blah, blah. But that's because most of the time, the way they treat other human beings is only half of the way they treat themselves internally. You can't make a sigma feel bad about his performance any more than he would do it to himself. So you try and make a sigma feel bad for something he did or didn't do quite well enough or whatever, you're going to have pretty much one of two responses. A, he either won't care at all because it's completely irrelevant to him, or there's no way you can make him feel worse than he's already making himself feel. A sigma's general valuation of themselves is not dependent on outside society. I don't care if you think I've done a shitty job. I care if I think I've done a shitty job. You could be praising me and I've done a shitty job, and I'll ignore your praise completely. And you could berate me thinking that I've done a shitty job, and I think, no, I did exactly what I wanted to do and it worked out the way I want and it's pretty good. And I couldn't care less about your berating me, other than to just assume you're an idiot and never work with you again and just get rid of you, like, fuck off. I don't want to deal with a person that doesn't understand the basics. I also think that sigmas are by and large one of the more objective people on the sociosexual hierarchy. They have to be, because our survival pressure most of the time is the society, the hierarchy of all other human beings, and we pretty much live outside of it. So we have to be aware of what is the actual danger and not the perceived danger. We have to be aware of what is actually probably going to kill you rather than what you think is going to kill you. And that's why, ultimately, I've often had this, even in a situation of work or whatever, where people tell me about, how could you be so calm? The guy was such an idiot, and he was, being really rude and offensive and blah, blah, blah. And it can go both ways, because if they're rude and offensive in a specific way that is very personal, or that is just unacceptable to me for whatever reason, that's when everybody leaves the room at very high speed. On the other hand, when a guy's just, losing his shit and everybody's getting worried and scared because he's raising his voice or whatever, I'm like, there's nothing. And again, because I've been through life experiences where I've had people, try and kill me. I've had regularly a bunch of people in front of me trying to beat the crap out of me. That was just training. That wasn't even anything, they weren't trying to kill me, but they were definitely, breaking bones and stuff. And that was just training. So, what's a guy across the table from me getting irate about some contract going to do? What, is he going to throw a gun and shoot at me? Well, even if he is, he's better have good reflexes, because otherwise he's going to eat that gun. So, it's like, who cares? And that phases people, because they're not used to that level of lack of, I suppose, what you'd call standard response. I mean, here's a good little example. At one point, I worked for a French company where they took this other guy took over, some French guy, and his management style was to try and pretend to be all, friendly and chummy, and then lose his shit with some random thing and just berate the person and be like really sort of aggressive and whatever, so that normal people would get sort of stunned by that sort of thing, like, what's going on, and then psychologically he would have a little bit of a hold over them. And I'd seen him the first 2 days. I'd figured out exactly who he was and what he was going to do, and I saw him do it to other people, and I was like, But what this guy didn't know is, like, on my first day with this company, the guy that originally hired me, he had a bit of a screaming match. It's a French company. They like scream like weirdos to each other and insult each other, and then 5 minutes later it's all done and they're working together. And we were all sitting at a desk, the guy that hired me, one of the project managers, and myself. And these two guys start going at each other in French, which, I understand pretty well. So I knew exactly what they were going on about. And they started like really like, you stupid asshole, you did it fucking wrong. And the other guy's like, no, you moron, it's because you don't understand percentages. You call yourself a director, you can't even fucking do a percentage, you idiot. And this went on for like 5 minutes solid. I'm just standing there, literally sitting at the same desk as these guys, and it was a weird triangular type desk. And then they quiet down, and then like 2 minutes later, one guy goes, oh, what's the answer for that number? And the other guy, yeah, it's this. And I just looked at both of them, and I said, listen, I just want to tell you guys, this is my first day here and whatever, and I know you're French, and I know. But if either of you ever speaks to me like that, they're going out the window. There's not going to be a conversation. They will be flying out the window. Just letting you know, because you're French and you've got your ways. I'm Venetian and I got mine. And nobody ever raised their voice with me. To their credit, they understood that. They respected the fact that it's like, oh, he's a little bit different. No problem. But this new guy that came in, this new manager, he tried the shit, except, my work was actually propping up the whole project and the whole company, because it was a claim issue, which I know how to do very well, and I outperformed every expectation they had. So I'm now sitting in his office when he's like saying, oh, but your fees, and I'm like, what about my fees? He goes, no, they're too high. I said, compared to what? I've made you 3 times the money that you asked at your wildest idea. So I'm expensive compared to what? I've made this company more money than you have. Besides, égalité, fraternité, isn't that what the French thing says? So why don't you pay me what you're getting? And, he had no answer for that. And it stung him. So then he tried it, a bit later he tried something else. He said, no, come have a coffee with me. I'm like, I don't really have coffee, but okay, fine. And as we're doing it, and I did it on purpose because I knew what was coming. So I had my little espresso. I opened up the sugar bit, and I just carelessly spilled some of it on the table. You know, half went in the cup and half went on the table. And I just acted like nothing happened. He was like, and I seized this moment. You know, I could almost see his little gears working. And he looked at me and goes, but no, now you've made a mess. You've spilled the sugar. Yeah. No, but... And then he stood up and he started his performance coming out. You know, this is a mess. How can you spill the sugar like that? You know, he started to raise his voice. And I just calmly looked at him, let him get into it a little bit. Then I said, hey, what are you? A little bitch? You're worried about a little bit of spilled sugar when you pissed away hundreds of thousands because you weren't watching the project? Are you a man or have you got your period? You know, just cut him down. Also because in theory I'm his subordinate, right? But nobody. I'm a freelancer. I'm nobody's subordinate. So he didn't know how to say anything. And he couldn't, you know. And then he said, no, but your work is very good. And I said, no, listen. Did you call me in here to tell me you love me? Because I don't care. Show me the money. And it better be a thick wad. All right? Don't tell me you love me. I don't care. And I got up and walked out. You know, that's... If you're a manager and you're trying to handle a Sigma, it's just bad news. If you don't understand the concept of sociosexual hierarchy, you really need to. But, you know, if you understand the concept and you know, Sigmas tends to be pretty effective people. They have to be, again, in order to survive. So if you get one that has a particular skill set or whatever, and, you know, you point them in the right direction and then you let them loose, you can achieve outstanding results with them, you know. So it's interesting. And I thought I'd shed a little bit of light on it. Because I do think there are two types. The damaged Omega that becomes Sigma later on is one type, and the other type is one that I think is genetically an explorer, a curious guy, and just isn't scared. You know, and that leads you into all sorts of problems as well. You know, it's not... But now, why does everybody want to be the Sigma? Oh, because it's super cool, it's super cool, it's super cool. The thing is that people that think that don't know what it's like to be anything other than what they are. So they just make a lot of assumptions. Sure, it's cool if you're James Bond, you know, you get to bang all the pretty girls, you get to kill the bad guys and get away with it because you got a 00 license. But, you know, if you look at it from the point of view of, like, would you actually like to be the James Bond character in reality? Well, he's always alone, he can't really have a proper relationship, he can't really have kids because they'll eventually get killed by some of his enemies. He's basically always getting shot, chopped up into little pieces, betrayed. And he's often having to, like, work against the people that he's supposedly working for because often they're themselves corrupt and so on. You know, what kind of a life is that? It's a pretty tough life, you know. Similarly, like people that, oh, I'm the alpha, I want to be the alpha. Do you? Do you really want to lead the group? Because guess what? When you're leading the group, anything that goes wrong is your fault. Any little problem, people come and bitch and moan to you. Everything goes wrong, they look to you to fix it. You know, so it's useful for you to know who and where you are. And the fact is, gammas are growing exponentially simply because we're not having enough wars and there's not enough threats to life wiping them out. Because in a primitive or war situation type of setup, gammas will get used as sandbags. They will be shot and used to protect the sandbags, honestly. Because they're just, you know, the only reason gammas have essentially managed to breed so much is because, you know, sigmas and alphas and bravos went out there and they left the village idiot at home, you know, and then the irritating village idiot they left at home, and then the smart irritating idiot they left at home because, oh, there's enough of us and we've civilized society. But, you know, back in the day, a gamma was just, if he got found out, he would usually have his throat slit just for being so annoying. So, you know, there is I think it's on Alpha Blog, one of Vox's blogs. There is a I think it's called Graduating Gamma. I've never read it, but apparently it's very good. There are people that were gammas that did become deltas, and I know some of them, and one of them is a really good guy. I really like him a lot. He's one of the Dread Ilk, and you know, he owned up and said, you know, I used to be a gamma and did this, and then this is how I got out of it. And he's an awesome guy. I really like him. He's a very interesting guy. He's you know, he's knowledgeable about a lot of things. And the main thing that he says he had to learn to become a delta was to keep quiet. Just to keep quiet and observe. And not, you know, try and correct anybody, not try and speak up and show everybody how smart he was, but just be quiet and watch. And that's good advice for almost everybody anyway. So, well, there you go. That's my little expose on sigmas. And we'll see when and if Vox eventually does his bit. You can look at the differences between what I've said and what he said, and, you know, see what you think. But I don't think there's going to be a huge number of differences in what I've said. The only thing might be that I do believe there are two types of sigmas. One that is sort of a little bit more genetically oriented, and one that is a bit more perhaps situationally created. Although that might just be the way it goes. There's not a huge number of sigmas around, so it's pretty difficult to study them in a methodical, statistical sort of way. So these are my thoughts on the matter. And that's it. I guess now everybody's going to comment on just how sigma they are. And, you know, if you're not a sigma, well, that's because you're not a double sigma. And if you're not a double sigma, it means you're not double wielding your Colt 45s hanging upside down from a helicopter. Okay, have a good Sunday.